My third cup of stale break room coffee was the only thing keeping me upright during the 2 a.m. inventory sweep of storage room B. I was currently running on 4 hours of sleep, sheer corporate panic, and a desperate need to find 3 missing pallets of thermal tape before the morning audit. Instead of thermal tape, I found a mountain of a man. He was sprawled out on a freshly unrolled sheet of our premium, industrial-grade bubble wrap, dead to the world. A security jacket was tossed haphazardly over his broad chest. Something inside my deeply overcaffeinated, overworked brain simply snapped. I was drowning in spreadsheets, and this absolute giant was treating my logistics center like a 5-star hotel. I marched over, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete. Instead of nudging his heavy, steel-toed boots out of the way, I picked them up. With a feral burst of defensive adrenaline, I hurled one boot down the sterile hallway. It hit the metal lockers with a deafening crash. The man didn't jump. He didn't scramble. He just lazily opened his eyes, blinked at the fluorescent lights, and looked up at me with a slow, devastatingly calm smirk. "Get out of my building before I dropkick you into traffic!" I shrieked, my voice echoing off the corrugated ceiling, completely unhinged. "You're fired!" A deep, rumbling laugh vibrated from his chest, entirely unbothered by the fact that I was currently winding up to throw his second boot. "Are you always this aggressively adorable at 2 a.m?" he asked, resting his hands behind his head. "Or is this a special occasion?"
Hello, everyone. It's Tiana. Welcome back to Tiana's Romance Collections, your go-to spot for the best spicy, slow-burn shifter romances on YouTube. Before we dive into today's audiobook, where a highly stressed manager accidentally fires her undercover billionaire alpha, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and guarantees you won't miss out on any of the swoon-worthy, high-tension stories we have coming up. Grab your popcorn, get comfortable, and let's get into the chaos.
Chapter 1. I didn't throw the second boot. Instead, I dropped it squarely onto his chest, spun on my heel, and marched out of storage room B with the phantom sensation of his low, rumbling chuckle still vibrating against my spine. By 9 a.m., the caffeine had worn off, leaving behind a jagged, frantic energy that made my hands shake as I stood in front of the human resources desk. "I need termination paperwork for the night guard on sub-level 2, I told Brenda, tapping my pen aggressively against her counter. Massive guy. Looks like a lumberjack who got lost on his way to a flannel convention. He was sleeping on the premium bubble wrap. Brenda blinked slowly, clicking her mouse. "Bridget, we don't have a night guard on sub-level 2. The warehouse is automated after midnight." "He was wearing a company jacket," I insisted, my voice pitching up in panic. "Badge number 402. Brenda tapped her keyboard again, her brow furrowing. "Badge 402 was retired 3 years ago. Are you sure you didn't just dream him up? You've been working 80-hour weeks since the logistics audit was announced." My stomach plummeted. The crushing weight of my own imposter syndrome crashed over me. Was I finally losing it? Had the sheer terror of managing this department finally fractured my sanity, manifesting as a 6-foot-something hallucination with a devastatingly sharp jawline and an infuriating smirk? "Right," I muttered, backing away from the desk. "Right. Stress hallucination? I'll just go drink some water." I practically sprinted back to my office, retreating into the tiny, glass-walled sanctuary where I could quietly hyperventilate in peace. I collapsed into my desk chair and buried my face in my hands. I was failing. I was a mid-level manager hanging by a thread, and now I was seeing ghost employees sleeping in the shipping supplies. I squeezed my eyes shut. The latch of my office door clicked. Before I even looked up, the air in the room shifted. A dense, crackling pressure filled the confined space, followed instantly by the crisp, overwhelming scent of rain-soaked pine and dark roast coffee. I lowered my hands. Standing in the doorway, completely filling the frame, was my hallucination. He wasn't wearing the stolen security jacket anymore. Instead, he was poured into a spectacularly ill-fitting, cheap gray suit that looked like it was actively begging for mercy across his incredibly broad shoulders. He was holding 2 steaming lattes in a cardboard carrier, looking around my aggressively color-coded office with a mixture of sheer amusement and sharp, unblinking focus. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him with a quiet, decisive click. He seemed too large for the room, stealing all the oxygen just by breathing. I scrambled backward in my rolling chair, my defensive reflexes spiking instantly as he approached my desk. He set a latte down next to my keyboard, his golden brown eyes locking onto mine with that same intensely calm smirk from the supply closet. "HR sent me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that made the pens on my desk vibrate. "I'm your new executive assistant. Where do I sit?" Chapter 2. I stared at the man filling my doorway, my brain misfiring as it tried to process the sheer audacity of his presence. He had to duck slightly just to avoid grazing the doorframe. "HR sent you," I repeated, the words tasting like copper on my tongue. I looked from the steaming latte on my desk back up to his infuriatingly calm face. "To be my executive assistant, a man who, roughly 7 hours ago, I found hibernating on shipping supplies in the basement." "Technically," he drawled, leaning his massive shoulder against the glass wall of my office. "You found me in storage room B. Sublevel 2 is strictly for overflow." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice dropping into a dangerous, clipped whisper. "And how did you bypass building security?" "Wyatt," he said simply, offering no last name, no explanation, and absolutely no apology. He gestured to the cheap gray suit that was pulling tight across his chest, the buttons fighting for their very lives. "And I'm a temp. Brenda upstairs said you were, and I quote, drowning in a sea of your own neurotic making and desperately needed administrative support." My jaw locked. I wanted to throw the coffee at him, but the dark roast smelled incredible and I was dangerously undercaffeinated. I took a defiant sip. It was perfect. That only made me angrier. "Fine, Wyatt," I snapped, gesturing to the tiny, cramped cubicle situated just outside my office door. It was designed for a petite intern, not a human bulldozer. "Sit there. Your job is to digitize the current quarterly projections. Do not speak to me. Do not look at me. And if you fall asleep on your keyboard, I won't throw your boots, I will throw you." Wyatt chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made my traitorous pulse jump, and folded his massive frame into the tiny, ergonomic chair. It groaned in protest. For the next 3 hours, I tried to ignore him. It was completely impossible. Through the glass wall, I watched him navigate my carefully curated filing system. He looked utterly ridiculous, his large hands dwarfing the computer mouse, his brow furrowed in deep, intense concentration. But what unnerved me wasn't his size. It was his stillness. He didn't fidget. He didn't tap his foot. He moved with a deliberate, heavy grace that felt entirely out of place in a frantic logistics hub. By noon, the tension in my shoulders was a solid block of ice. I gathered up the most convoluted, headache-inducing stack of paperwork I owned, the Henderson Logistics contracts, and marched out to his desk. "Alphabetize these," I ordered, dropping the massive stack onto his desk with a heavy thud. "Then cross-reference them with the shipping dates. If you finish before 5, I'll eat my own stapler." Wyatt didn't blink. He just picked up the first file. I retreated to my office, finally feeling a surge of managerial control. I had buried him in busy work. He would quit by 3. 45 minutes later, I glanced up from my screen. Wyatt wasn't typing. He wasn't reading. He was holding a manila folder halfway to his face, his eyes closed, taking a long, deep inhale through his nose. He lowered the folder, scowled, and casually tossed it into the trash can under his desk. He picked up the next file, sniffed it, kept it, picked up the third, sniffed it, tossed it in the trash. I threw my office door open so hard it rebounded off the stopper. "What are you doing?" I hissed, marching over to his trash can. I peered inside. Half of the Henderson contracts were buried under a crumpled sandwich wrapper. Wyatt leaned back in the tiny chair, crossing his arms over his chest. The cheap suit jacket strained dangerously. "I'm sorting the files, boss." By smelling them? I practically shrieked, pulling a discarded contract out of the garbage. Why are the Henderson files in the trash? Wyatt shrugged, his golden brown eyes completely deadpan. Because Mr. Henderson smells like a liar, trust me. Chapter 3. He doesn't smell like a liar, Wyatt. He smells like a multi-million-dollar vendor contract. I whisper-yelled, speed-walking down the crowded downtown sidewalk. He smells like cheap cologne and offshore tax fraud, Wyatt replied effortlessly, matching my frantic, stressed-out pace with long, lazy strides. And I'm telling you, the numbers on page 4 were fabricated. I stopped dead in my tracks outside Mickey's, a greasy, chaotic 24/7 diner that permanently smelled of burnt bacon and desperation. You didn't even read page 4. You threw it away before you opened the folder. Wyatt just offered that infuriating, devastating smirk, reaching over my shoulder to push the heavy glass door of the diner open for me. I'm a very fast reader, I groaned, marching into the crowded restaurant. The noise was deafening. Plates clattering, waitresses shouting orders, the hiss of the deep fryer. I hated holding vendor meetings here, but Mr. Henderson insisted it was authentic. I scanned the sticky vinyl booths, my stomach twisting into a knot of anxiety. Henderson hadn't arrived yet. Sit, I ordered Wyatt, pointing to a small 2-person booth in the corner. Do not speak during this lunch. Do not smell the client. Just sit there and look like you know how to take notes. Wyatt slid into the booth, his broad shoulders practically eclipsing the window behind him. Whatever you say, boss. For the next 20 minutes, I sat alone at a larger table nearby, nervously checking my watch. The diner was claustrophobic, the air heavy with grease and the overwhelming chatter of the lunch rush. Every time I glanced over, Wyatt was completely still, his eyes tracking the room with a sharp, calculating intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't look like a temp. He looked like a predator analyzing a cage. By minute 30, it was clear Henderson was a no-show. My phone buzzed with a curt, unapologetic email canceling our meeting. The dam of my anxiety broke. The lost contract, the lack of sleep, the sheer humiliation of being stood up in a diner that smelled like old mop water. It all came crashing down. I buried my face in my hands, taking a ragged, shaky breath, trying desperately to hold back a wave of exhausted tears. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over my table. My nerves, already frayed to the absolute breaking point, snapped. Before my brain could register who was standing behind me, my defensive instincts hijacked my body. I spun out of the booth, grabbing the heavy wrist that was reaching toward my shoulder. I planted my foot, shifted my center of gravity, and violently threw my entire weight forward, executing a flawless, panicked judo flip. The man flew over my shoulder with a startled grunt. He crashed into the adjacent table with a catastrophic, deafening clatter. Plates shattered. A pitcher of water exploded. A mountain of half-eaten buttermilk pancakes flew into the air, raining down onto the vinyl floor in slow motion. The entire diner went dead silent. I stood there, panting, my fists raised, the adrenaline roaring in my ears like a jet engine. I looked down. Wyatt was sprawled flat on his back amid the wreckage of Table 4. His cheap suit was completely soaked in ice water. A perfectly round, butter-drenched pancake was resting squarely on his left shoulder. Horror washed over me like ice water. "Oh my God!" I choked out, dropping to my knees. Wyatt, I am so sorry. I didn't know it was you." Wyatt didn't move for a long, agonizing second. Then, a massive, syrup-covered hand came up to wipe a stray piece of bacon off his jaw. He let out a breathless, rumbling sound that I quickly realized was laughter. He looked up at the ceiling, groaning happily. "Wow. You actually hit harder than my... Never mind. Can we order more bacon?" We were kicked out of the diner. After paying for the destroyed table, the ruined dishes, and violently apologizing to the waitress, I practically dragged my syrup-covered assistant out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sky had opened up, unleashing a torrential, freezing downtown downpour. My car is parked 3 blocks away. I muttered, shivering as the rain instantly plastered my blouse to my skin. We need to run. Your car has a dead battery, Wyatt stated calmly, shaking the rain out of his dark hair like a massive, unbothered dog. I froze, wiping the water from my eyes. What? How do you know that? Because when we walked past it 20 minutes ago, the alternator belt smelled like burnt rubber and despair. He gestured toward the concrete stairwell leading beneath the street. Subway it is. Before I could argue about his impossible sense of smell, a crack of thunder shook the pavement. I admitted defeat, jogging down the stairs into the humid subterranean chaos of the city transit system. It was rush hour. The platform was a sea of damp, miserable commuters. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the doors opened, and the crowd surged forward like a physical wave. I was instantly shoved from behind, my heel slipping on the wet tile. A heavy hand clamped firmly onto my hip, steadying me with shocking ease. Wyatt maneuvered himself behind me, absorbing the brunt of the shoving crowd as he guided us into the packed train car. The doors hissed shut. We were trapped in a metal tube with 100 irritated strangers, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and cheap umbrellas. I stumbled as the train lurched forward. Wyatt's arm shot out, bracing his hand flat against the heavy metal door right beside my head. He shifted his stance, stepping directly in front of me. Instantly, the claustrophobic nightmare of the train vanished. Wyatt had essentially caged me into the corner. His massive frame blocked out the rest of the car entirely. He stood with his feet planted wide, his other hand gripping the overhead rail, his chest mere inches from my face. As the crowd shifted and swayed, bumping into his back, he didn't budge a single inch. He was an immovable, unyielding wall of solid muscle, acting as a human shield against the chaos. The sheer physical proximity stole the breath right out of my lungs. I was pressed against the cold metal door, but all I could feel was the intense radiating heat coming off his body. The scent of rain, pine, and faint maple syrup enveloped me, utterly intoxicating and entirely overwhelming. I looked up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Wyatt was looking down at me. The lazy, teasing smirk was completely gone. His jaw was clenched tight, his golden eyes blown wide, tracking the movement of the crowd behind me with a sharp, predatory intensity. Every time a commuter bumped into him, a low, barely audible vibration rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that felt suspiciously like a growl. The air between us grew impossibly thick. The frantic energy of my anxiety was entirely swallowed up by the heavy, electric tension radiating from him. I could feel the steady, thumping rhythm of his heart through the damp fabric of his suit. "Wyatt," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. I tried to press myself flatter against the door to give him space, but there was nowhere to go. "You don't have to guard me like a dog." Wyatt's gaze snapped down to my mouth, his pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely black. The train rattled violently, throwing him a fraction of an inch closer. He leaned in, his warm breath ghosting across my cheek, his voice dropping a full, devastating octave. "Who said anything about being a dog?" The subway doors hissed open, breaking the agonizing electric vacuum he had trapped me inside. Brutal, cold, underground air rushed into the train car, but the phantom, scorching heat of Wyatt's chest remained permanently branded into the front of my damp blouse. I scrambled out onto the concrete platform, absolutely refusing to look back, though I could feel his heavy, unhurried footsteps tracking right on my heels like a shadow. By 3 p.m., the adrenaline of our commute had entirely curdled into raw, unadulterated corporate panic. We were back in the sterile, fluorescent glare of Conference Room B. I was scheduled to run a massive mock logistics pitch for the regional directors in exactly 45 minutes, and every piece of technology in the room was actively conspiring against me. "The clicker is dead," I muttered, aggressively tapping the plastic remote against the heavy mahogany table. "The laser pointer is mysteriously missing, and this—" I marched over to the heavy canvas projector screen bolted to the ceiling, grabbing the metal pull handle. "This is completely jammed." I yanked on the handle, It didn't budge a millimeter. I planted my heels into the industrial carpet, gritted my teeth, and threw my entire body weight backward, letting out a frustrated, strangled noise. The screen remained stubbornly rolled up in its casing, mocking my total lack of upper body strength. "Hey!" A low, gravelly voice rumbled from the doorway. "Stop. You're going to pull a muscle." Wyatt strolled into the room, casually discarding his ruined, rain-soaked suit jacket over a leather executive chair. He had rolled the sleeves of his dress shirt up to his elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with dense, shifting muscle. He moved with that same infuriating, lazy grace, stepping right up behind me. "Let me try," he murmured. He reached over my head. For a split second, I was completely engulfed in his massive frame. The scent of rain, damp wool, and dark roast coffee washed over me, so fiercely potent it made my knees lock in place. Wyatt casually grasped the metal handle. He didn't brace his legs. He didn't even take a deep breath. He simply gave the handle a sharp, irritated tug downward. The sound of tearing metal echoed through the room like a gunshot. I shrieked, instinctively diving under the conference table as a catastrophic shower of drywall dust. Metal screws and acoustic ceiling tiles rained down from above. A massive crash shook the floorboards, rattling my teeth in my skull. Absolute silence descended on the room, save for the pathetic hum of the air conditioner. I slowly peeked out from under the mahogany edge, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Wyatt was standing exactly where I had left him. He was holding the entire 10-foot projector assembly, metal casing, torn canvas, and jagged chunks of drywall in his bare hands. He looked down at the wreckage, his thick, dark eyebrows drawing together in mild, genuine confusion, as if the heavy industrial machinery had simply dissolved upon contact. He gently set the massive steel contraption onto the floor. It hit the carpet with a heavy, dead thud. I crawled out from under the table, coughing and brushing white plaster dust out of my hair, my mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. I stared at the gaping, jagged hole in the ceiling, then slowly lowered my gaze to his hands. "I think," Wyatt offered helpfully, nonchalantly brushing a speck of plaster off his knuckles. The latch was stuck. I stared at the shredded, impenetrable canvas, then at Wyatt's suspiciously sharp fingernails, my logistics-oriented brain desperately trying to calculate the physics of what had just occurred. "What kind of protein powder are you taking?" "We have 22 minutes before the regional directors walk into that ruined room," I hyperventilated, practically dragging Wyatt by the wrist down the rain-slicked pavement. "We are going to buy a portable whiteboard, we are going to carry it up 4 flights of stairs, and we are going to pretend the ceiling did not just spontaneously combust." "You're walking exceptionally fast for someone wearing heels on wet concrete," Wyatt noted, effortlessly keeping pace with my frantic march. He didn't even look winded. He was holding a large black umbrella over my head, though he seemed entirely unbothered by the freezing drizzle hitting his own broad shoulders. "I run on anxiety, caffeine, and pure spite, Wyatt. Keep up." I yanked open the heavy glass door to O'Malley's Hardware, a dusty, chaotic, and dimly lit shop crammed between 2 corporate high-rises. The brass bell jingled cheerfully. The air inside smelled deeply of cut pine, motor oil, and fertilizer. "Whiteboards," I muttered, speed-walking past a display of garden hoses. "Office supplies. We need a whiteboard, markers, and maybe some spackle. Where are the—" "Aisle 7, Wyatt stated instantly, pausing near a towering rack of power drills. He inhaled slowly, his nose flaring just a fraction. "Bottom shelf on the left." I didn't have the mental capacity to ask how he could possibly smell dry erase markers from 40 feet away. I simply rounded the corner into aisle 7, just as the store owner, a massive, heavily bearded man wearing a grease-stained canvas apron, stepped out from the back stockroom. The owner looked up, a friendly retail smile already forming on his face. Instead, his eyes locked onto Wyatt, who had just sauntered into the aisle behind me. The color completely and instantly drained from the owner's face. The heavy cardboard box of iron nails he was holding slipped right through his fingers, crashing to the linoleum floor with a sharp, deafening clatter. Before I could even ask if the poor man was having a sudden medical emergency, the massive, bearded hardware store owner dropped straight to his knees. He bowed his head so low his chin physically touched his chest, his thick hands trembling violently against his thighs. I didn't know," the owner stammered, his voice entirely stripped of oxygen, practically weeping. "Forgive me. I didn't know you were in the territory." I froze, completely paralyzed by the bizarre, horrifying display. I looked at the terrified owner on the floor, then slowly turned around to face my executive assistant. Wyatt had gone completely rigid. The lazy, relaxed temp was entirely gone. His jaw was locked tight, his shoulders squared in a terrifying posture of absolute crushing dominance. The sheer weight of his presence seemed to suck all the warmth and air directly out of the aisle. He looked at the kneeling man, his golden eyes flashing dangerously in the fluorescent light. "Get up," Wyatt ordered, his voice dropping into a guttural, terrifyingly quiet register that vibrated right through my sternum. "Now." The owner scrambled backward on his hands and knees, knocking over a cardboard display of duct tape, too utterly terrified to even look Wyatt in the eye. My brain desperately tried to connect the chaotic dots. A terrifyingly strong man, a fake identity at HR, a local business owner dropping to his knees in sheer, unadulterated terror on a Tuesday afternoon. My hands moved on pure, defensive autopilot. I reached out and snatched a heavy, 3-foot length of industrial PVC pipe from the adjacent bin. I stepped backward, gripping the pipe like a baseball bat, and pointing it directly at Wyatt's chest. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt physically dizzy. "Who do you owe money to, Wyatt?" I demanded, my voice shaking with raw defensive panic. "Because I am not going to jail for a temp." I didn't fire him. I should have fired him. I should have called the police, or the FBI, or whoever handles terrifyingly muscular men who extort local hardware store owners. But we made it back to the office with a whiteboard. The mock pitch was a resounding success, and Wyatt went right back to aggressively alphabetizing my logistics files by cent. 2 days later, corporate HR dealt me the final fatal blow. "Mandatory team building," I whispered, staring blankly out the frosted, ice-covered window of the corporate charter bus. "In a blizzard, 3 hours up a mountain. I am going to die in the wilderness, and HR will dock my final paycheck for attendance." "It's just a weekend retreat, boss," Wyatt murmured from the cramped seat beside me. His massive thigh was pressed firmly against mine, radiating a frankly ridiculous, scorching amount of body heat. He had spent the entire agonizing bus ride staring out the window, tracking the dense, snow-covered pine forests with an intense, predatory focus. When we finally reached the Silver Peak Lodge, the temperature had plummeted to single digits. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding horizontal sheets. I trudged blindly through the knee-high snowdrifts, dragging my sensible rolling suitcase, while Wyatt easily carried my heavy duffel bag over one shoulder, completely untouched by the freezing wind. We reached cabin 12. My teeth were chattering so violently I could barely fit the brass key into the lock. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stumbled inside, desperate for a heater. I stopped dead in the tiny entryway. The cabin was agonizingly small. It consisted of a stone fireplace, a cramped kitchenette, and exactly one piece of furniture situated directly in the center of the room. A single, shockingly small, full-sized mattress. "No," I breathed, dropping my suitcase handle, my tired brain rejecting reality. "No, this is an administrative error. Brenda from HR explicitly told me management gets solo cabins. Assistants sleep down in the bunkhouse." Wyatt stepped inside, kicking the heavy door shut against the howling wind. He took one look at the tiny, quilt-covered bed, then at my horrified face. "The bunkhouse roof collapsed under the snow last night," he noted calmly, dropping my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. "The bus driver mentioned it. They consolidated the lists." "I will sleep in the bathtub," I declared, my voice pitching up defensively as I backed away from the bed. I marched toward the bathroom door, only to find a microscopic stall shower and a toilet. "I will sleep standing up in the shower, like a horse." You'll freeze to death in about 4 hours, Wyatt replied smoothly. He walked over to the fireplace, effortlessly hauling a massive, heavy oak log onto the iron grate. The insulation in these cabins is garbage. You can already feel the draft. I stood in the center of the room, my panic rapidly spiraling. I could barely survive a daily commute with this man without my biological hardwiring going completely haywire. Sharing a tiny, confined space while a literal blizzard roared outside felt like walking blindly into a loaded trap. The air inside the cabin already felt thicker, heavy with the overwhelming scent of him, rich pine, damp earth, and wood smoke. Wyatt brushed the bark off his hands, turning slowly to face me. He looked at the single, very small mattress, then casually leaned his heavy frame against the wooden bedpost, crossing his thick arms over his chest. That slow, infuriating smirk crept back onto his devastating face. "Well, boss," he drawled, his golden eyes glinting sharply in the dim, freezing cabin light. "Are you a kicker or a blanket hog? Because I'm definitely a cuddler." "I am a kicker," I shot back, clutching the handle of my rolling suitcase like a heavy plastic broadsword. "I am a kicker, a biter, and I sleep with a very sharp ballpoint pen under my pillow. Do not test me, Wyatt." He simply laughed, a low, vibrating rumble that immediately seemed to thaw the freezing air in the tiny cabin, and turned his attention back to the stone fireplace. For the next 2 hours, the blizzard outside evolved from a heavy snowfall into a catastrophic, howling whiteout. The temperature dropped so drastically that frost began creeping up the interior panes of the windows. I sat shivering at the microscopic kitchen table, desperately trying to type out logistics emails on my laptop while wearing my thick wool winter coat, my gloves, and a beanie. Every time I shivered, Wyatt's jaw tightened. He moved around the cramped cabin with that frustratingly silent, heavy grace. He brewed a pot of tea on the ancient electric stove. But instead of just bringing me a mug, I watched from the corner of my eye as he picked up my discarded blanket from the bed. He didn't just carry it over. He gripped the thick wool tightly in his massive hands, slowly running his palms over the fabric, pressing it against his chest before draping it securely over my freezing shoulders. 10 minutes later, he picked up my spare scarf from the counter. He dragged it casually across the nape of his own neck, a movement so smooth and deliberately biological it made my breath hitch. Before wrapping it snugly around my throat, the cabin was freezing, but my core was suddenly radiating heat. The sheer proximity of him was overwhelming. Every single time he stepped close, the air pressure shifted, completely saturating my senses. I pulled the thick blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to focus on the spreadsheets on my screen. But my brain was short-circuiting. The wool didn't smell like dusty cabin storage. It smelled fiercely, undeniably like him. A rich, intoxicating wave of dark roast coffee, damp pine needles, and heavy, raw masculinity wrapped around me like a physical shield. My biological hardwiring was absolutely betraying my logical corporate brain. The sheer, overwhelming scent of him didn't trigger my defensive instincts. It instantly and terrifyingly shut them off. I felt a profound, heavy sense of safety sink into my bones. I paused my typing, my fingers hovering over the frozen keyboard. I slowly pulled the collar of my scarf up over my nose, taking a long, shaky breath. I looked up at him across the tiny room. He was leaning against the stone hearth, watching me with those dilated, fiercely focused golden eyes. "Wyatt," I whispered, burying my face deeper into the thick wool of the scarf. "Why does all my clothing suddenly smell like pine, rain, and... you?" Before Wyatt could answer, the fluorescent bulb above the kitchenette gave a violent flicker. A second later, the Wi-Fi router on the counter beeped twice and completely died. "No!" I gasped, slamming my hands onto the table. I stared at the little red no-connection dinosaur on my laptop screen. No, 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 I have to send the updated shipping manifest to the regional board by midnight or they are going to use it as an excuse to liquidate my department. "Bridget," Wyatt said, stepping away from the fire. "The storm just took out the cell towers down in the valley. You couldn't send an email right now if your life depended on it." "You don't understand." I surged to my feet, the panic finally breaking through my exhaustion. I am barely holding on. I am completely unqualified for this position. The board knows it, and I am one missed deadline away from being publicly humiliated. I paced the tiny length of the cabin, my boots thudding against the hardwood. I am a fraud, Wyatt. I'm a low-ranking, neurotic fraud pretending to be a manager, and they are going to find out. Wyatt didn't mock me. He didn't offer a lazy, condescending smirk. He moved perfectly into my path, forcing me to stop pacing. He was so large he completely blocked out the light from the fire. He looked down at me, the tension in his broad shoulders completely dissolving into something quiet, heavy, and intensely fragile. "You aren't a fraud," he rumbled, his voice dropping to a raw, barely audible whisper. "You fight for your team. You fight for your job. You practically threw a man through a diner table to protect a vendor contract." He looked away, his jaw clenching as he stared into the dark, frozen window. "You want to know what a fraud looks like?" he asked, his tone laced with a sudden suffocating bitterness. "A fraud is someone who inherits a massive, high-stakes empire and is so completely paralyzed by the fear of leading it that he hides in a stolen security jacket in the basement of his own building." I went perfectly still. The sheer gravity of his confession sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. He turned his golden eyes back to me, and for the first time, I didn't see an immovable, terrifyingly calm giant. I saw a man actively drowning under the crushing weight of other people's expectations. If I have to stand up in front of a boardroom and speak... Wyatt swallowed hard, his massive hands curling into fists at his sides. My chest caves in. I can't breathe. I can't think. I have all the physical power in the world, Bridget, and a single microphone completely breaks me. The dynamic of the room inverted in a split second. The terrifying, intimidating man was gone, leaving behind a profound, devastating vulnerability that made my heart ache. I slowly stepped into his space, completely abandoning my corporate armor. I reached out, gently wrapping my freezing fingers around his massive, tightly clenched fist. "If it makes you feel better," I whispered, looking straight into his eyes. "I throw up in the bathroom before every board meeting. We can be terrified together." Wyatt stared down at my hand covering his chest rising and falling in heavy, ragged intervals. The intense, scorching heat radiating from his skin sent a shockwave straight up my arm, but I absolutely refused to pull away. "Okay," I breathed, rapidly shifting into my defensive fixer mode to mask the sudden, overwhelming intimacy suffocating the room. "Okay. Public speaking is it's just logistics, Wyatt. It's an algorithm. If you look the part, the board doesn't actually care what you say." "Bridget, stand up straight," I ordered, my voice trembling slightly as I took a step closer. Wyatt blinked, confused, but his biological obedience to my sudden shift in tone overrode his hesitation. He pulled his shoulders back, towering over me. "Wider stance," I instructed, my logistical brain desperately trying to manage the terrifyingly attractive man currently occupying my personal space. "When you address a room, you need to anchor yourself. Don't look at their eyes. Look exactly 2 inches above their foreheads." I reached up, pressing my palms flat against his chest to manually adjust his posture. It was a fatal mistake. The moment my hands flattened against the solid, dense muscle of his chest, the final thread of our self-control violently snapped. His heart was hammering a frantic, brutal rhythm directly against my palms. Wyatt sucked in a sharp, hissing breath through his teeth. His hands shot out, gripping my hips with a heavy, possessive desperation that sent a jolt of pure electricity down my spine. "Bridget," he growled, the word tearing out of his throat, entirely stripped of his lazy temp worker facade. Your shoulders are too tense," I stammered, completely unable to move away. I was trapped against him, staring up at his devastatingly sharp jawline, entirely consumed by the scent of pine and raw, predatory heat. "I don't care about my shoulders," he rasped, his thumbs pressing firmly into my hips as he eliminated the last fraction of an inch between us. He ducked his head, his face hovering mere millimeters from mine. His warm breath ghosted over my parted lips. My eyes fluttered shut. I reached up, my fingers desperately twisting into the crisp cotton of his shirt, pulling him down. Clack! The overhead fluorescent bulb blazed to life with a blinding, sterile flash. The electric heater violently kicked on, roaring loudly in the corner of the cabin. The power was back. We sprang apart like we had been physically burned. I stumbled backward, my spine colliding painfully with the edge of the kitchen counter, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. Wyatt stepped back, raking a trembling hand through his dark hair. The veins in his thick forearms were completely pronounced, his chest rising and falling in violent, uneven intervals. He stared at me, his golden eyes completely dilated, black and completely feral. He didn't apologize. He didn't make a joke. If that power had stayed off for 5 more seconds, Bridget, he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly hum that made my knees instantly buckle. I would have... We didn't speak for the entire 3-hour drive back down the mountain. The heavy, agonizing silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic, hypnotic thud of the windshield wipers aggressively shoving slush off the glass. Wyatt gripped the steering wheel of the company SUV so tightly his knuckles were completely stark white, his eyes locked dead ahead on the winding, treacherous asphalt. The radio played a static-laced stream of local weather alerts, but I couldn't hear a single word of the broadcast over the deafening, frantic hammering of my own pulse. I sat rigidly in the passenger seat, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, staring blindly out the side window. The oppressive, suffocating heat of the tiny cabin, the raw, electric tension of that near kiss, had seemingly followed us right into the vehicle. Every time the SUV hit a pothole, our shoulders brushed. Every time they brushed, a violent, sparking jolt of sheer adrenaline practically rewired my nervous system. By the time we finally pulled into the sprawling, brutalist concrete parking garage of corporate headquarters, my nerves were completely and utterly fried. I practically threw myself out of the passenger door the exact second the vehicle shifted into park, desperate for the freezing, exhaust-choked city air. We marched through the glass atrium lobbies and scanned our badges at the security turnstiles like entirely different people. The rugged, hyper-vulnerable man from the fireplace was instantly replaced by the stoic, infuriatingly unreadable temp worker. I retreated immediately to my glass-walled office, burying myself behind a barricade of incredibly urgent shipping manifests, actively refusing to look out into the bullpen. But I could feel him. Even separated by a pane of frosted glass and 30 feet of generic corporate carpeting, the sheer, undeniable gravity of his presence pulled at my focus. The air in the entire logistics wing felt inexplicably denser, humming with a low-frequency vibration that made the hairs on my arms stand at absolute attention. By 2 in the afternoon, the cowardice became physically unbearable. I grabbed a massive, utterly pointless stack of Q3 expense reports and marched blindly down the hall to the supply corridor. I needed the monotonous, rhythmic distraction of the copy machine. I shoved the heavy glass door open and stepped into the small windowless print room. The air inside tasted sharply of ozone, hot plastic, and burnt laser toner. I slapped the stack of papers onto the feeder tray, forcefully jamming my thumb against the bright green start button. The machine roared to life, churning out copies with a deafening mechanical thwack, thwack, thwack. Then, the door clicked shut. I didn't even need to turn around. The sudden, drastic shift in air pressure instantly gave him away. The sharp, mechanical scent of the printer ink was entirely obliterated by the overwhelming dark wave of pine and rain-soaked earth. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the plastic edge of the copier so tightly my fingers ached. "You're scanning blank requisition forms," Wyatt murmured. His voice was a low, devastating rumble that resonated perfectly over the aggressive churning of the machine. I slowly turned around. He was standing barely 2 feet away, having completely shed the cheap gray suit jacket. His crisp white button-down was rolled to the elbows, exposing the thick corded muscle of his forearms. He leaned back against the heavy wooden door, essentially barricading us inside the tiny, claustrophobic space. His golden brown eyes were utterly locked onto mine, burning with a dark, unyielding intensity that made my breath completely stall in my throat. "They need to be digitally archived," I lied, my voice shaking with pathetic, transparent desperation. "Bridget," he rasped, taking a single, deliberate step forward. The space between us vanished. He was so close I could see the tiny, chaotic flecks of amber buried deep in his irises. The sheer, radiating heat rolling off his chest was intoxicating, melting away the sterile chill of the corporate air conditioning. I didn't back away. The reckless, defensive surge of adrenaline that usually made me throw staplers suddenly mutated into an intense, overwhelming demand for answers. I took a step forward, closing the final inch, forcefully pressing my palm flat against the center of his chest. His heart slammed violently against my hand. "What were you going to say?" I demanded, my voice dropping into a breathless, ragged whisper. "In the cabin. When the power came back on, you said if it had stayed off for 5 more seconds. What were you going to say to me, Wyatt?" Wyatt let out a harsh, shuddering breath. His massive hands came up, gripping my waist with a sudden, bruising desperation. He backed me smoothly, inevitably against the edge of the vibrating copy machine, leaning down until his lips were hovering a mere fraction of an inch from mine. "I wasn't going to say a damn thing," he growled, completely feral. He tilted his head. The print room door violently swung inward, slamming heavily against the doorstop. We physically tore apart, gasping for air as if we had been violently submerged in freezing water. I stumbled against the paper recycling bin, my face burning with a humiliating scarlet flush. A terrifyingly stern, silver-haired senior executive was standing in the doorway, clutching an incredibly expensive leather portfolio. He didn't even glance at me. His icy, calculating eyes locked directly onto Wyatt, who was currently dragging a shaking hand over his jaw. "Mr. CEO," the executive barked, his tone devoid of any patience. "We need you in the boardroom. Now." I froze. The humming of the copy machine suddenly sounded very, very far away. My brain violently misfired, trying to process the absolute absurdity of the title. I looked at the impeccably dressed executive, and then slowly turned my head to stare at my massive, seemingly incompetent temp assistant. "Mr. Who?" The agonizing silence in the tiny copy room stretched so thin it threatened to snap and decapitate us all. The humming of the printer tray abruptly stopped, plunging the windowless space into a suffocating, heavy quiet. I stood perfectly frozen against the plastic edge of the machine, my eyes darting frantically from the terrifyingly poised senior executive in the doorway directly to the massive, broad-shouldered man standing mere inches from me. Wyatt didn't flinch. He didn't gasp, but the intricate, subtle muscles along his sharp jawline locked so violently I genuinely thought his teeth might shatter. A terrifying, predatory darkness entirely swallowed the golden warmth in his eyes. "Sterling," Wyatt said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a guttural, terrifyingly quiet warning, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to physically rattle the toner cartridges inside the printer. The senior executive, Sterling, blinked. A brief, chaotic flash of profound terror crossed his icy, arrogant features. He looked at Wyatt's clenched fists, then quickly darted his gaze over to me, desperately trying to calculate the explosive dynamic of the room. I apologize," Sterling stammered, his impeccable corporate posture crumbling into a subtle, instinctive cringe. "I was just making a joke, a poor attempt at humor regarding the urgency of the scheduling. The temp agency mentioned you were highly capable, so I thought—" Sterling swallowed hard, completely abandoning the lie mid-sentence as Wyatt took a single heavy step toward him. "I'll just wait upstairs." Sterling practically fled down the hallway, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him with a mocking, dismissive click. I stood in the corner, my chest heaving, desperately trying to force oxygen back into my starved lungs. Wyatt slowly turned to face me. The ferocious, protective alpha demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. He raised his hands, taking a hesitant, deeply cautious step toward me like I was a live explosive. "Bridget," he started, his voice completely hollowed out. "A joke," I repeated, my voice devoid of any inflection. The words tasted like ash. I looked at his cheap, ill-fitting gray trousers, then back up to his devastatingly intense face. "A senior executive, a man who has actively made me cry in 2 separate elevator rides, just sprinted away from you in sheer terror because of a temp agency joke." "He's under a lot of pressure," Wyatt offered, though the lie sounded physically painful coming out of his mouth. I didn't scream. I didn't reach for a stapler or a heavy paperweight. Instead, the frantic, emotional chaos in my brain instantly shut down, forcefully overridden by the cold, calculating, deeply neurotic logistics manager that kept this entire department from entirely collapsing. "Right," I whispered, smoothly picking up my stack of completely blank requisition forms. I stepped around his massive frame, strictly avoiding any physical contact. "I need to get back to my desk. The final pitch is in 2 hours." I walked out of the print room, leaving him standing in the heavy scent of hot ozone. The moment I sat down in my ergonomic mesh chair, my brain began assembling the terrifying, impossible puzzle pieces. I stared blindly at the chaotic spreadsheets on my dual monitors, completely ignoring the flashing red icons of unread emails. Piece 1. The greasy downtown diner. He had easily slapped down a sleek, matte black titanium credit card to pay for the completely destroyed table of pancakes without so much as a second thought. Piece 2. The hardware store. The massive, bearded owner hadn't just been afraid. He had dropped to his knees in an ancient, primal display of absolute submission, referring to Wyatt's presence in the territory. Piece 3. The sheer, impossible strength. He hadn't just broken the heavy canvas projector screen, he had completely snapped the industrial steel housing with his bare hands just because it was frustrating me. Piece 4. The scent. The overwhelming, intoxicating smell of dark pine and rain that commanded total, immediate biological compliance from everyone in the building, except me. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely manipulate the computer mouse. I minimized my logistics dashboard and opened the secure, encrypted corporate intranet portal. I bypassed the standard employee directory, my fingers flying across the keyboard with frantic, terrifying precision. I didn't care about his last name anymore. I cared about the chain of command. I pulled up the heavily guarded, anonymous ownership registry for Apex Logistics, a convoluted web of holding companies and phantom board members that I had never bothered to untangle. I initiated a deep-level administrative trace on the primary executive signature required for departmental liquidations. The loading icon spun lazily on the screen, mocking my rising panic. "Come on," I muttered, aggressively tapping my fingernail against the edge of the desk. "Let's see who really signs my paychecks." The screen flashed violently white. The encrypted holding companies dissolved, cleanly revealing the absolute top of the corporate pyramid. A high-resolution security badge photo loaded directly into the center of the screen, accompanied by a single terrifying title: Wyatt Thorne, Chief Executive Officer, Majority Shareholder. My lungs completely stopped working. I stared at the photo of my incompetent, devastatingly handsome temp assistant. The crushing weight of the revelation didn't make me cry. It didn't make me scream. It forged my absolute terror into a heavy, impenetrable suit of cold iron armor. I closed the browser window with a sharp, violent click of the mouse, gathered my massive 300-page presentation binder, and marched blindly toward the executive suite. The mahogany doors of the primary boardroom loomed at the end of the frosted glass hallway like the gates of hell. Inside, the massive, sprawling circular table was already occupied by 8 incredibly hostile regional directors. They sat in their bespoke Italian suits, murmuring in low, predatory tones, completely ready to gut my department and sell the scrap metal to the lowest bidder. I walked to the front of the room, dropping my heavy binder onto the polished wood with a resounding, defiant thud. The doors in the back of the room quietly clicked open. Wyatt slipped inside. He was back in his atrocious, poorly fitted gray jacket, clutching a flimsy plastic clipboard. He looked incredibly pale, his broad shoulders hunched forward in a desperate, deeply unnatural attempt to make himself look smaller. He stood awkwardly by the catering table, his golden eyes locking onto mine with an agonizing mixture of silent apology and sheer, unadulterated terror. He was genuinely vibrating with panic. I looked right through him. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice ringing out with a cold, terrifyingly steady clarity that I didn't know I possessed. Turn to page 4 of the executive summary. As you can clearly see, the quarterly projections are entirely sustainable. For the next 30 excruciating minutes, I fought a losing war. The board didn't care about my perfectly optimized shipping routes or my flawless vendor retention rates. They were systematically dismantling my numbers, interrupting every single sentence with condescending, impossible metrics designed purely to force my failure. "Your overhead is bloated, Bridget," Sterling sneered from the center of the table, lazily spinning a gold pen between his fingers. He looked completely relaxed, having fully regained his arrogant composure. "The regional distribution centers are a massive financial sinkhole. We don't need your mid-level management structure. It's an archaic waste of company capital. The structure is what prevents catastrophic supply chain failures," I shot back, my defensive anger finally cracking through the cold armor. "If you liquidate this wing, you will lose the Henderson account by Friday." "Henderson is already looking elsewhere," Sterling interrupted smoothly, offering a distinctly predatory, dismissive smile. He leaned forward, aggressively closing his copy of my presentation binder. "The vote was held this morning, Bridget. This meeting is merely a courtesy to inform you of the transition. Your department is completely liquidated. Please leave your security badge with HR on your way out." A profound, ringing silence fell over the massive room. The floor completely dropped out from beneath me. The blood drained so rapidly from my face, I swayed dangerously on my heels. Everything I had bled for, every sleepless night, every shattered nerve, erased with a single, arrogant stroke of a gold pen. I slowly looked down at my hands. They were trembling. From the back of the room, a plastic clipboard violently hit the floor. The sharp, echoing crack made every single executive at the table flinch. I slowly raised my head. Wyatt wasn't hunching anymore. The agonizing, crippling fear of public speaking that had kept him trapped in the shadows completely vanished, instantly vaporized by a blinding, ferocious wave of pure, biological rage. He stepped away from the catering table. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his presence hit the room like a physical shockwave. The air instantly tasted of dark thunder and ozone. He walked slowly down the center aisle. Every step he took was heavy, deliberate, and entirely predatory. He didn't look at me. His pitch-black, dilated eyes were locked entirely on Sterling. "Excuse me?" Sterling barked, his arrogant facade slipping as he stared at the massive temp worker approaching the table. "Security is explicitly meant to wait in the hall." Wyatt slammed both of his massive hands flat onto the polished mahogany table. The wood groaned in violent protest under his sheer, terrifying strength. He leaned over the center of the table, towering over the cowering executives like a furious, vengeful god. "The regional distribution centers will remain fully operational," Wyatt commanded. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a low, guttural, earth-shattering boom that physically vibrated the crystal water glasses on the table. Sterling went completely white, his jaw dropping open in sheer, paralyzed horror. "The Thorne!" he choked out, completely unable to breathe under the crushing weight of the Alpha's aura. Wyatt didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He commanded the room with absolute, terrifyingly flawless authority. He conquered his absolute worst fear without a single stutter, driven entirely by his desperate need to protect me. "Your department is liquidated, Bridget," Sterling had sneered. Wyatt turned his head slowly, locking his ferocious, unyielding gaze with the trembling senior executive. "Over my dead body." "Over my dead body," Wyatt repeated, the words dropping into the sterile boardroom like heavily armed explosives. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profoundly suffocating. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his presence hit the room like a physical shockwave, entirely displacing the oxygen. The air instantly tasted of dark thunder, sharp ozone, and the raw, unadulterated dominance of an apex predator pushed to the absolute edge of his patience. Sterling didn't just pale, he practically liquefied into his custom leather chair. The arrogant, condescending sneer was entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a trembling, primal terror that made his perfectly manicured hands shake violently against the mahogany wood. Every single executive at the massive circular table instinctively leaned away from the center, their biological hardwiring screaming at them to submit to the towering, furious man standing at the head of the room. Wyatt didn't even look at them. He kept his dilated, pitch-black eyes locked entirely on Sterling, his massive hands still planted firmly on the table. "The regional distribution centers will remain fully operational," Wyatt commanded, his voice a low, guttural vibration that rattled the crystal water pitchers. "The mid-level management structure is not bloated. It is the only thing preventing catastrophic supply chain failures due to executive incompetence. And if any of you," he paused, his deadly gaze slowly sweeping across the terrified board members, "ever attempt to liquidate a logistics wing without my direct written authorization again, I will personally ensure you never find employment in this city for the rest of your natural lives." He reached out, easily snatching Sterling's gold pen right out of his trembling fingers. With a sharp, terrifyingly casual flick of his thick wrist, Wyatt snapped the solid metal pen entirely in half. He dropped the broken pieces onto Sterling's open portfolio. "Meeting adjourned," Wyatt rumbled. The executives scrambled. It was a humiliating, chaotic exodus of bespoke suits and Italian leather shoes. They practically tripped over each other to escape the boardroom, desperately fleeing the suffocating heavy gravity of his wrath. Within 30 seconds, the massive room was entirely empty, except for me. I stood frozen at the head of the table, my hands hovering over my meticulously tabbed presentation binder. My brain was violently short-circuiting, desperately trying to reconcile the terrifying, commanding billionaire CEO standing next to me with the man who had let me yell at him for throwing away files. Wyatt took a long, ragged breath. The ferocious, predatory darkness in his eyes slowly receded, bleeding back into that familiar, warm, liquid gold. The terrifying alpha aura dissipated, leaving behind a man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit who looked utterly exhausted. He turned to face me, his broad shoulders visibly relaxed, a soft, incredibly vulnerable expression washing over his devastatingly sharp features. He looked down at me, fully expecting relief. He expected gratitude. He expected me to collapse into his arms, thanking him for conquering his absolute worst fear just to save my career. Instead, the cold iron armor of my shock completely shattered, releasing a torrential, boiling wave of absolute, unadulterated fury. He hadn't been hiding in the basement because he was a temp. He hadn't let me boss him around because he was lazy. He was the CEO. He was the pack alpha. He owned the building, he owned the board, and he owned me. I had bought him coffee. I had taught him how to use a stapler. I had spent a sleepless, agonizing night in a freezing cabin coaching him on how to be confident, pouring out my deepest, most humiliating insecurities about being a fraud, to a man who was literally defrauding me. "Bridget," he started, taking a hopeful step toward me, his massive hand reaching out to touch my arm. "Do not," I hissed, my voice shaking with a feral, defensive rage that made him instantly freeze in his tracks. "Do not touch me." I stepped back, my chest heaving, the blood roaring in my ears like a freight train. I looked at the broken gold pen on the mahogany table. I looked at his ridiculously broad chest, currently encased in the very temp agency shirt I had helped him pick out the lint from. "You own the company," I whispered, the reality of the deception tasting like copper and ash on my tongue. "You stood there and watched me have panic attacks over losing my job. You let me think I was protecting you from corporate HR. You let me think we were in this together." "We are in this together," Wyatt pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate, raw gravel. "Bridget, please, I couldn't tell you. You were the only person in this entire building who treated me like a human being instead of a what?" I shrieked, completely losing my mind. "A god? A billionaire? A massive manipulative liar?" I didn't think. I just reacted. I reached down and grabbed the heavy 300-page hardbound presentation binder from the table. With a ferocious, guttural scream of pure spite, I hurled the massive binder squarely at his chest. It hit him with a deafening, heavy thud. Wyatt didn't even flinch, though the sheer force of the impact sent a shower of meticulously organized spreadsheets and color-coded pie charts exploding into the air like corporate confetti. "I quit!" I screamed, turning on my heel and marching blindly toward the heavy mahogany doors. "Bridget, wait!" Wyatt roared, the panic in his voice completely shattering his alpha composure. "Don't follow me!" I snapped over my shoulder, shoving the boardroom doors open with enough force to crack the drywall. "You are completely, utterly, officially fired." The frantic, jagged adrenaline carried me all the way down the frosted glass hallway, down 3 flights of concrete stairs, and straight into my tiny claustrophobic office. I didn't cry. I absolutely refused to cry. I grabbed a folded cardboard archive box from beneath my desk, violently popped it open, and began indiscriminately shoving my life into it. Thwack. My favorite ergonomic stapler. Thwack. My framed photo of my dog. Thwack. 3 boxes of thermal shipping labels. The entire logistics wing was dead silent. The bullpen of cubicles outside my office was completely empty, the staff having mysteriously vanished the moment the sheer, terrifying scent of an enraged alpha had flooded the ventilation system. The glass walls of my office suddenly vibrated. I didn't look up from the cardboard box. The air pressure in the room plummeted, the oxygen instantly replaced by the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of dark roast coffee and furious, rain-soaked pine. "I am not accepting your resignation," Wyatt's voice rumbled from the doorway. It wasn't a request. It was a heavy, biological command, layered with enough sheer alpha dominance to make my knees physically buckle. I locked my joints, gripped the edges of my cardboard box, and slowly turned around. He was completely filling the doorway, his massive hands gripping the metal frame so tightly the aluminum was actively groaning under his strength. His chest was heaving, his golden eyes completely swallowed by dilated, pitch-black pupils. He was radiating a scorching, desperate heat that threatened to entirely melt my defensive anger. "You don't have a choice," I fired back, my voice dangerously quiet. I stepped out from behind my desk, clutching my box of office supplies like a shield. "Employment is at will in this state, Mr. Thorne. Now move out of my doorway." "Bridget, stop," he pleaded, the terrifying alpha tone violently fracturing into sheer, desperate vulnerability. He dropped his hands from the doorframe, taking a heavy step into my tiny office. "Just listen to me. 5 minutes. Please." I stripped away the title because it was suffocating me. I hid in that closet because I was drowning. And then you came in, and you yelled at me, and you threw my boots, and for the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me and didn't expect anything. "I expected you to alphabetize the Henderson files," I yelled, the sheer absurdity of the situation finally boiling over. "I expected you to be my assistant. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I was terrified of Sterling, and you could have fired him on day 1. You watched me panic over a projector screen when you owned the damn building. If I told you I was the CEO, you would have stopped yelling at me." Wyatt stepped closer, his massive frame trapping me against the edge of my desk. The raw, desperate honesty in his voice was devastating. "You would have built a wall. You would have looked at me exactly like Sterling does, like a boss, like a title, like a predator. I just wanted to be your assistant, Bridget. I just wanted to be yours." My heart gave a violent, traitorous lurch against my ribs, but the cold iron of my pride held firm. "You don't get to buy my trust by playing dress-up in a cheap suit," I whispered, my voice shaking. I shoved the cardboard box forcefully against his solid, immovable chest. "Move." Wyatt stared down at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered near his temple. He could have physically stopped me with 2 fingers. He could have used his sheer, overwhelming biological dominance to force me to stay in the room. Instead, he slowly, agonizingly stepped aside. I marched out of the office, down the carpeted hallway, and straight toward the main elevators. I jammed my finger against the down button. The doors instantly slid open. I stepped inside, slamming my hand against the lobby button. Just as the metal doors began to slide shut, a massive, dress-shoed foot wedged itself into the gap. The doors violently rebounded. Wyatt stepped into the confined elevator car, the heavy steel doors sliding shut behind him, sealing us inside a microscopic metal box. "I am taking this elevator to the ground floor," I stated, staring straight ahead at the illuminated floor numbers, my knuckles completely white as I gripped my cardboard box. "If you speak to me on the way down, I will hit you with this tape dispenser." Wyatt didn't speak. He just stood directly behind me. The sheer, radiating heat of his massive body blanketed my back, the heavy, intoxicating scent of him entirely filling the confined space. I could hear the ragged, uneven rhythm of his breathing. The physical proximity was absolute torture, a slow burn agony that made every single nerve ending in my body scream in protest. When the elevator finally dinged at the ground floor, the doors slid open to reveal the sprawling, marble-floored corporate lobby. I marched out, my heels clicking sharply against the polished stone, heading straight for the revolving glass doors. Wyatt followed me, his heavy footsteps echoing across the cavernous space. Security guards instantly snapped to attention. Receptionists froze at their desks. The entire lobby fell dead silent, watching the tiny, furious logistics manager aggressively speed walk away from the towering, desperate billionaire CEO. "Bridget!" Wyatt called out, his voice echoing off the marble pillars, completely abandoning any pretense of corporate dignity. I didn't stop. I hit the revolving glass door and pushed out into the freezing, rain-slicked city street, leaving him entirely behind. Inside the lobby, Wyatt stopped dead in his tracks. He dragged a massive, trembling hand over his face, his chest rising and falling in heavy, defeated intervals. Brenda, the head of HR, slowly stepped out from behind the security desk. She adjusted her glasses, looking from the shattered Alpha to the empty revolving doors. "You saved her job, Alpha," Brenda offered gently, trying to offer a lifeline of consolation. Wyatt let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. He stared at the rain streaking down the glass, watching my blurry figure disappear into the chaotic downtown crowd. "I didn't save anything," Wyatt rumbled, his voice completely broken. "I just lost the only woman who ever treated me like a human being." The smell of burnt bacon and ancient mop water had never been more depressing. I sat alone in the corner booth of Mickey's 24/7 diner, staring blankly at a soggy buttermilk waffle. My cardboard box of office supplies was sitting on the sticky vinyl seat across from me, a grim, pathetic monument to my currently unemployed status. The diner was packed with the late afternoon rush, construction workers shouting over the clatter of plates, waitresses rushing by with heavily laden trays, the deep fryer aggressively hissing in the background. I aggressively stabbed my waffle with a plastic fork. I was completely miserable. My defensive anger had entirely burned out, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing ache in my chest. My hands were freezing, completely missing the ridiculous, scorching heat of the massive idiot who had lied to me. The bell above the diner door violently chimed. The sound wasn't unusual, but the immediate, suffocating shift in the air pressure was. The ambient noise of the diner didn't just quiet down. It completely evaporated. The clattering of plates ceased. The conversations died in people's throats. I froze, my plastic fork hovering over my plate, instantly recognizing the heavy, intoxicating wave of dark pine and rain sweeping through the grease-filled air. I slowly turned my head. Wyatt was standing just inside the entrance. He looked entirely out of place, a towering, devastatingly handsome billionaire radiating raw, terrifying power in a room full of cracked linoleum and cheap neon beer signs. He had ditched the terrible gray jacket, clad only in a crisp white dress shirt that strained dangerously across his chest. He was soaked from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his golden eyes scanning the room with a frantic, predatory intensity. His gaze locked onto my corner booth. He didn't hesitate. He marched across the diner, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. The patrons practically shrank into their booths as he passed, their biological instincts utterly terrified by the sheer, unadulterated dominance rolling off his massive frame. I crossed my arms over my chest, lifting my chin defiantly, absolutely refusing to look intimidated. Wyatt reached my table. But he didn't slide into the booth across from me. He didn't drop to his knees, and he didn't try to invoke his alpha authority. Instead, he took a deep breath, unbuttoned his cuffs, and stepped right up onto the heavy chrome and vinyl chair opposite my booth. My eyes widened in sheer, absolute horror. "Wyatt, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He planted his heavy work boot directly onto the center of the sticky, laminate diner table. The table groaned violently in protest. With a terrifying lack of grace, the massive, broad-shouldered billionaire hoisted his entire gargantuan frame up onto the table. He stood there, towering over the entire diner, his head completely brushing the cheap acoustic ceiling tiles. Every single person in the restaurant was staring at him. 3 people had already pulled out their cell phones. "Excuse me," Wyatt roared, his booming, gravelly voice echoing off the greasy walls, instantly commanding the attention of every single soul in the building. I sank down into my vinyl booth, burying my face in my hands, my face burning with a humiliating scarlet flush. Oh my God, he's actually lost his mind. "My name is Wyatt Thorne," he announced loudly to the crowded diner, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of absolute sheer panic and desperate resolve. He was facing his absolute worst phobia, public speaking, while standing on a table that smelled like old syrup. "I own a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire. I am the alpha of this territory, and I am a complete, absolute idiot." A construction worker in the back booth slowly nodded in agreement. Wyatt looked down at me, his chest heaving, his golden eyes completely soft and entirely vulnerable. He completely ignored the phones recording him. He ignored the waitresses staring in shock. The stakes were entirely emotional, and he was stripping away every single piece of his armor. "I lied to the smartest, fiercest, most violently protective woman I have ever met," Wyatt continued, his voice dropping slightly, laced with a raw, desperate humor. "I let her think I was a temp. I let her aggressively organize my files by scent. I let her throw me over a table into a pile of pancakes in this exact restaurant, which, by the way, I completely deserved." I peeked through my fingers, fighting a sudden, treacherous smile that was desperately trying to break through my scowl. "I hid behind a fake badge because I was terrified of my own life," Wyatt confessed, his voice vibrating with absolute sincerity, completely laying his soul bare in front of 50 strangers. "But I am not terrified anymore. Because the only thing in this world that absolutely terrifies me is the thought of going back to an office that doesn't have her in it." He slowly lowered himself to one knee on the creaking table, completely ruining his expensive slacks in a puddle of spilled coffee. He reached down, offering his massive, calloused hand to me across the tabletop. "I don't want to be your boss, Bridget," Wyatt whispered, the deafening silence of the diner amplifying the raw, gravelly devotion in his tone. "I want to be your partner, in the company, in the pack, and in everything else. And I will stand on this sticky table forever until you forgive me." I stared at his outstretched hand, the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of him entirely wrapping around my heart. The cold iron of my anger completely melted, replaced by a fierce, undeniable warmth. He had faced his worst fear, abandoned all his pride, and humiliated himself in a greasy spoon just to prove he was entirely mine. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. I looked at his desperate, gorgeous face, fighting the massive grin spreading across my cheeks. I reached up, wrapping my small fingers around his massive, incredibly warm hand. "Get down from there before you break a leg, you absolute idiot," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "And you're paying for my waffles." Wyatt let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a massive, relieved sigh. He didn't just step down from the table. He practically vaulted off it, his heavy boots hitting the sticky linoleum with a resounding, floor-shaking thud. The diner immediately erupted into a chaotic chorus of cheers, scattered applause, and a few sharp, echoing whistles from the construction crew in the back booth. My face was burning so hot I was probably glowing in the dark. But I couldn't stop the ridiculous ear-to-ear grin stretching across my face. I didn't care about my ruined dignity. I didn't care that 3 people were still recording us. Wyatt ignored the crowd entirely. He pulled his matte black titanium credit card from his damp trousers and casually tossed it onto the counter. "For the waffles," he told the stunned, wide-eyed waitress, his golden eyes never leaving my face. "And the table. And whatever everyone else in this building is having for the rest of the afternoon." He didn't give her time to process the billionaire-level tip. He smoothly reached over, plucked my pathetic cardboard box of office supplies right off the vinyl seat, and tucked it effortlessly under one massive arm. With his free hand, he firmly laced his thick, calloused fingers through mine. The sheer size of his hand completely engulfed mine, a shocking contrast to the sleek, untouchable corporate world he supposedly ruled. He pulled me gently but decisively out of the chaotic diner and back into the freezing, rain-slicked city streets. The storm had finally broken, leaving the pavement glittering brightly under the streetlights. But I didn't feel the winter chill anymore. His grip was an absolute anchor. 1 hour later, we bypassed my cramped sub-level office entirely. The private executive elevator chimed softly, the heavy stainless steel doors sliding open to reveal the absolute apex of the corporate pyramid, Wyatt's penthouse suite. It was a massive, sprawling expanse of dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling glass, and quiet, untouchable luxury. The city skyline stretched out far below us like a glittering, rain-washed carpet of diamonds. It was completely dead silent. No humming copiers, no ringing phones, no chaotic bullpen chatter. The air smelled of expensive leather, aged wood, and him. Wyatt dropped my cardboard box onto the center of his ridiculously expensive, perfectly organized executive desk. He didn't walk around to his plush leather chair. Instead, he turned to face me, taking a slow, deliberate step forward until the backs of my knees bumped against the polished mahogany edge of the desk. The physical gap between us, painstakingly and agonizingly maintained for weeks, entirely vanished. He stepped flush against me, his massive frame completely boxing me in. The intoxicating, heavy scent of dark pine, fresh rain, and crisp cotton wrapped around me, pulling me under like a rip current. I tilted my head up, my heart hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against my ribs. "So," I breathed, my voice barely above a ragged whisper, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of professional banter, while my hands instinctively moved up to rest flat against his solid, unyielding chest. "This is where you've been hiding from the logistics reports." "I wasn't hiding from the reports," Wyatt murmured, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that seemed to physically vibrate straight through my collarbones. "I was hiding from Sterling's 3-hour PowerPoint presentations. There is a very distinct, heavily documented difference." His hands came up, resting heavily and possessively on my waist. The slow burn tension that had been dangerously crackling between us for weeks finally, inevitably combusted. He didn't hesitate anymore. He leaned down, his mouth crashing down onto mine with a fierce, desperate intensity that completely shattered my remaining corporate armor. I gasped, my fingers instantly tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. He tasted like black coffee, rain, and raw adrenaline. His sheer physical power was completely focused into a devastatingly tender, breath-stealing kiss. He lifted me effortlessly by the waist, setting me gently onto the edge of the mahogany desk, stepping firmly between my knees to pull me absolutely flush against his chest. When we finally, breathlessly broke apart, my highly analytical, logistics-oriented brain was entirely offline. I rested my forehead against his sharp jawline, closing my eyes and desperately trying to remember how to breathe. "Okay," I gasped, my fingers blindly tracing the collar of his dress shirt. "Okay, new corporate structure. I run the logistics empire. You run the board. And if Sterling ever looks at me sideways in a meeting again, I will personally throw him out of this window. Wyatt rumbled effortlessly, pressing a soft, lingering kiss right below my ear that sent a violent shiver down my spine. Consider it standard operating procedure. Good, I whispered, shivering again as his lips traced a slow, deliberate path down the side of my neck. And I get the corner office on the 60th floor, the one with the good espresso machine. It's yours, he agreed without a second thought, his breath ghosting warmly over my skin, his thumbs tracing slow, distracting circles on my hips. Take whatever you want. I tilted my head back, a breathless, genuine laugh escaping me as the absolute absurdity of the situation finally settled into a perfect, undeniable reality. The billionaire alpha who terrified the entire city was completely, hopelessly tethered to my desk. Wyatt leaned back just far enough to look into my eyes, his golden gaze entirely soft, filled with a lazy, devastatingly handsome smirk that I now knew belonged entirely to me. So, he drawled, his voice a low, teasing hum that promised absolute chaos. Does the boss need anything else? I grabbed the silk lapels of his collar, pulling him back down until our lips were a fraction of an inch apart. Yeah, I smirked. Get back to work before I fire you again.